You'll see the title here, which applies in some ways and maybe doesn't. Academic model or useful business concept. Is organizational resilience a useful term for us within the industry? And I'd very much like, at the end of all of this, to get a feeling really from the audience, which is why we're here today, as to what the viewpoint is out there, as to whether this is useful, because there is a lot of talk around it. Who are Steelhenge? Just very briefly, we are a consultancy company that does a lot of consultancy in crisis management, BC, risk, crisis comms. Therefore, the advantage of that, and I'll move on quickly, is that it means we see an awful lot of different businesses, whereas a lot of you potentially work in one business. So we're very privileged like that we get to see how all sorts of different people do their business from day to day, which is very fortunate. As a result of all of this, rather rashly, I put my hand up by mistake about 18 months ago at a BC meeting and ended up being volunteered to run a subgroup to look at organizational resilience and how we can map its contributing disciplines. Fortunately, Claudia was able to help me very much on this, and together we led the subgroup looking at this over about a year, and we ended up with a group of people from the industry, all members based across the world, working up a paper which was launched at the Business Continuity Awareness Week this year, and very happily it seemed to cause quite a lot of interest, and the objectives were to look at is there a value to mapping organizational resilience. To be honest, the BCI had a certain cynicism, I think, around what is this thing resilience, it's not what we do. We also ran a follow-up survey to the paper, and what we're going to do today is briefly go through the paper, go through the results of the survey, and talk about some of the things that have come out of that, and then really what we need is to get a view from you guys as to what you think, whether this is useful, is it not useful, should this conversation stop and move on to other areas that are considered more important. So off we go. First of all, thank you, Charlie, for putting up the definitions. Another definition, not the same as Charlie's. We came up with this definition for organizational resilience, and I think it's very interesting, the point that was made about is organizational a problem term in this, but we may come back to that at the end. We could talk about this all day, in fact. But we came up with the capacity of an organization to plan for and adapt to change or disruption through anticipation, protection, responsive capacity, and recoverability. An all-encompassing concept, and we can talk about that more at the end if people disagree with it. There are always a lot of viewpoints. I think there's about, on our assessment, about 120 different definitions of resilience around at the moment. The organizational resilience world, we all know it and love it well. Masses of management systems out there, from risk to information security to HR. There is a crisis management publicly available specification, shortly to turn into British Standard 11200, for those of you that haven't come across it yet. So next year there will be a standard for crisis management, which is being backed by the Cabinet Office. There's also the world of communications, which doesn't have a standard, but it's very much out there in the resilience world. And you can see on the right-hand side all the plethora of standards that we all have so much fun playing with. Of particular relevance there is the new and forthcoming British Standard 45,000, which is going to be the standard for organizational resilience, and the draft of that has been published. Very interesting to look at. I'm not on the committee. It was fascinating to see where they're coming from now, and quite a challenge to set out a British standard for that. Not going to be like 25999, much more along the lines of guidance, you'll be pleased to hear, rather than a whole new series of specifications. We also have a huge number of institutes, good old BCI, Risk, Emergency Planning Society, and various institutes that are growing up now for resilience. There's one at UCL in London, one at Leeds, there are several in Australia and New Zealand. This is, whatever you may think yourself, a growing topic of discussion in the academic world, certainly. And there is a lot of discussion there about it. Could be dangerous, I hear you say. They're not practitioners. We'll leave that one to coffee break. So what makes a resilient organization? Is it a successful organization? Well, Lehman Brothers was very successful until they weren't. So probably they weren't resilient. Is it longevity? Potentially, quite an interesting term there. Is it about how long you've been in the game? That could be quite an interesting one. Is it about your size? Are you more resilient the bigger you are? Well, probably doubtful. Brand, very strong brand. You can see, and I don't have answers to this, there are lots of options here to look at as to what makes a resilient organization. So can we actually identify the characteristics that will go to make up an organization? And we came up with what I think were quite a good range, looking across the academic world, as well as looking at the practitioner community. And these were the characteristics that we came up with. Redundancy, and that doesn't mean putting people out of work. This is about an organization having spare capacity. A dangerous term in these recessionary times, but actually the resilient organizations are those that manage to carry spare capacity in some way to deal with the unexpected. Reliability, there is a whole world of work around high reliability organizations, but having that ability to keep functioning under stressful conditions. You can read the rest there, but anticipation, preparedness, back onto, I think, familiar territory. Flexibility, well, that's quite a challenging one. And you'll start to see these characteristics don't necessarily link straight through to business continuity. Adaptive capacity is one of the great terms that is used everywhere, and I think is an overarching term that does fit whatever model you're looking at. And learning capacity, an organization that will learn, and you would be staggered how many we see where something goes wrong and they still don't learn from their mistakes. Everyone is too busy rushing on, taking a deep breath and going, thank God for that. Off we go again and back to business. And I'm sure many of you will have seen that. So these are capabilities that provide resilience. And therefore, this gives us something useful to start to begin to work around. The capability to assess risks and threats and anticipate. The capability to plan and prepare. Obviously, that's very much where we all come from. The capability to adapt and respond, we're getting quite cultural in some ways there, and the capability to recover to a new normal state. And I think this is quite an interesting term. The old recover to business as usual actually probably doesn't apply here. The BBC, for example, would be a fascinating example. Where are they going to be next year? Because they're not probably going to be back where they were 6 months ago. All of the issues that they're going through at the moment could lead to them adapting to a new state. And this is where resilience starts to become really very, very interesting. I'm going to hand over now to the other half of my double act, the much better looking one, who will now go on to talk about the results that came out of the surveys and aspects of our work there. And then I will come back into the conversation in a little bit. Claudia, over to you.
Thank you very much. As Dominic said, we put out a survey to BC practitioners during BCall, and I think we compiled the results in about June of this year. And these are the first results. So we asked everybody, do they agree with what we've written in the paper? I mean, this was all Dominic and I spending hours and hours pontificating with a whiteboard, but it's all good and well what we think. What does everyone else think? Now, first interesting results was that everyone seemed to generally strongly agree that anticipation, preparedness, and adaptive capacity are characteristics of organizational resilience. There's a bit more controversy over redundancy, reliability, and learning capacity because there are actually some that disagreed with those. Capabilities-wise, strong agreement with plan and prepare and adapt and respond. Those seems to be the capabilities that organizations need to have in order to be resilient. Assessing and anticipating and recovering, interestingly enough, there was actually some disagreement with. And finally, the core disciplines. As you can see, business continuity and crisis and communications management were strongly agreed with. And there was a bit more disagreement with risk management, security management, InfoSec, HSE. Interestingly, I think that links back to the previous results in that the ability to prepare through business continuity and the ability to respond through crisis and communications are strongly agreed with, that that's what you need to be able to do if you're going to be resilient. We did a lot of reading and a lot of compiling, and I found one very interesting study I found where CEOs were interviewed. I think there were about 50-odd CEOs. Thanks, Amy. And very interesting results came out of this, in that during these interviews where they were asking them about what makes your organization resilient, the main things that came up were HR department, the board, and staff. So that shows CEOs think it is all about the people, and it's all about engaging with the board and the staff in order to actually become resilient. Business continuity only came in fourth, and what CEOs said is that it's a very important aspect of it in that you need to have your plan in place, and it needs to be right. But it's more of a tick of the box, and it's all about culture. And this culture is separated in this study into two different ones. Either the engineered one, which is a superimposed culture that you sort of create on top of your organization, and that involves training and exercising through the use of scenarios and simulations, or an emergent culture, and that's all about trust. Can I trust my people to behave in a way that will make sure we are resilient? And what they were talking about in this study is mostly a reporting and learning culture. So do I trust my people to behave in that way, to report near misses and failures and mistakes or errors, so that we can learn from it and therefore adapt? So clearly this emergent and engineered culture, the ethos, culture, behaviors, systems, plans, and processes, you need it all. You need it all to be resilient. But what's interesting really to us is, how does it all fit together? Again, as I said, Dominic and I spent hours pontificating with a whiteboard, and we came up with quite a few different models of resilience. And please bear in mind, we will make these PowerPoints available to you after the conference, and it's not about the detail, it's just about the concept and the way we were thinking about it that I wanted to share with you. So this was the first model that we came up with, which was a 4-stage process, and it involved prevention, planning, response, and recovery, and there are behaviors at the core of it. When we put it out to the survey, 71% thought that it was a useful model, and that was because they said it was chronological and directive. The problem with this model is that while we tried to map the individual disciplines into the different stages where we thought they'd play a biggest role, it doesn't show how they link up and where these touch points are. So that led us to this sort of model, a Venn diagram, where we look at the disciplines and where they overlap. And again, when we put that out to the survey, 61% said it was useful because they felt it was something they could provide their executives with, and the executive would have a clear overview of where he can best place his resources, where they're much needed, and sort of as a fortitude, as a strengthening factor for resilience. The problem with this one is there's a subtlety in where you place which discipline, and there was a lot of disagreement with where we had placed them on the model. So, it's a balancing act, I think. This model I'm handing back over to Dominic because it's complicated.
You sort of get what's going on here. I get the scruffy model. It's quite interesting looking actually potentially at people's behaviors, that people like models that are tidy, and particularly if they follow a chronological order. I'll put up the results of the survey in a second. This model is obviously, it's very, very messy. There's quite a lot of different things going on in it. But actually, I have to say, this was the one that I liked the most, in fact. It's not finished. It's got a long way probably to go. But along the bottom, you've got all the disciplines that maybe would be in a resilient organisation. I think we're probably missing 50% of them. These are the standard disciplines that you're all familiar with. Finance isn't there. HR isn't there. I think there's a lot more that needs to be done. I'm going to move back to my speakers. There's a lot more that needs to be done in terms of looking at the fact that resilience is about the whole organisation. It isn't just about our familiar areas. And therefore, I'd like to see a lot more across the bottom of that. However, what you've also then got above that is, where are the touch points? Where they meet in systems, management systems, where they're meeting in behaviours, where they're meeting in processes, plans and procedures. And actually, I think we could take this and you could start to work out, where do they all start to touch? Because it's those touch points of all of these different areas, which is where you're starting to look for integration, and it's where you're starting to work out, are you joined up in all those areas? And you can then start to look at assessing whether you're mature, possibly, in those areas. Then inevitably above that, you've got culture and ethos, and then maybe you've got something heading towards organisational resilience. It's not finished, but I think there was quite a lot of scope in this. Unfortunately, our survey result hated it, which I think maybe we didn't explain it very well. Maybe it isn't the right sort of thing. And who here, just to get a show of hands, who here thinks that that maybe has scope to be developed into something more interesting? Hands up. Whoa, okay, maybe I really am off song here. Who doesn't think this has? Who thinks this is probably a waste of time to be taken forward? Let's be honest. It's okay, I won't sob. Okay, no, that's interesting, and quite a lot of people are sort of maybe not too sure about really where they think it would go, because you'd need to see what it looked like next. Again, you can see how difficult, and we were surprised how complex it potentially was to try and model this sort of concept in a way. And I think that is because it's a concept. Because some people said, well, resilience is a thing. It's not a thing. It's a status that you are going to receive or you're going to achieve. And people find that quite difficult sometimes. I was expecting... The question is, where does all of this go next? Can the existing academic work, and Amy, I know your work went further than just academic work, that you did take it into producing a benchmarking concept and so on. Can this work be translated further into something that is practical for businesses? I think is probably in some ways the exam question that we face. Is it about organizational resilience? Should we call it corporate resilience and get off the fence and have corporate resilience and government resilience? Are they different? There's obviously also community resilience. There's a whole plethora of different areas that need to be looked at in order to take this maybe to the point where it does become more useful. I think the question for the BCI that they're interested in at the moment is, should the BCI continue trying to develop the thought leadership around this area, or actually should the BCI put it down because its members, you guys, actually don't really see much value in continuing this concept? And just to get, again, a very quick show of hands, who here thinks that this is a subject the BCI should maybe keep bubbling along and keep in the discussion forums, keep producing work around it? Okay, I'd say, yeah, that's good. There's a pretty strong reaction to that. Well, if you see, I don't know if Lyndon's in here, if you see Lyndon, can you tell him that, please? Bit of a pitch there. But it's quite difficult because there are obviously a lot of areas that they need to look at, and they only have so many resources. People like us do this work for them for free. And, our subgroup was terrific in the effort that they put in, and it takes all of you guys' effort to do these sorts of things. But they have to apply that effort where it really matters.